Hey everyone, this is episode number 5. I hope you're doing well. My name is Hugo and I'm the host of this podcast. A podcast in which I interview people for you to be able to create a better architecture. That is because I believe that the construction industry has the power to create a better world. A world where humanity and nature can live, coexist and flourish together. Today's guest is Scott McAulay. He's a young architect, climate justice activist, and the founder of the AAS. So we are going to talk about the climate crisis that we are facing today. The subject is going to be what is lacking in our institutions such as university, our government, and also our practices to respond to this crisis, and why is it lacking. And then we are going to talk about his work, what he created in response to this lack of knowledge and action from those institutions and the construction industry. And we are also going to understand how powerful is the construction industry and how you can take action today to make things change for the best. So that's enough me talking. We are going to jump right into the subject. So let's go. So Scott, who are you? What are you doing in life?
Oh, thank you very much. So, my name is Scott McAulay. He, him. I am a climate justice activist, a architectural graduate, and I coordinate the Anthropos Architecture School. So, what I've been doing for the past 2 years is really kind of encouraging that urgency around the climate and ecological emergency in the built environment. And that slowly kind of escalated from a protest that I started into being invited into universities to teach as well.
Okay, great. And you are also the founder of the AAS, which we'll talk about it later. But first, I want to understand, why did you start all of it? What was your main motivation?
So it kind of started as a kind of a back of the head idea when the IPCC released their 2018 special report on 1.5 degrees. I was studying abroad in Canada during my final year of architecture school, and I was quite shocked because nothing immediately changed after this report. So that was 2018. So it got to the January of that year, and I kind of had the idea. I'd seen the Architecture Fringe had their theme as in real life. So I really just took their in real life, there's a climate crisis, and just addressed it very bluntly and urgently. And the idea was really, it wasn't meant to be an educational endeavor. It was initially going to be, I contacted every RIBA validated school of architecture in the UK with an open letter and said, this is where we are. And I basically got like 2 responses from the 50 odd that I reached out to. So I kind of realized that there wasn't nothing was going to happen in that space for a while. So I just started working outside of that. So everything was very kind of guerrilla based. So instead of doing workshops in schools of architecture, I did workshops with each school of architecture. I did them in Glasgow, the New Glasgow Society, and it really just built up slowly. And I started to get invited places to do kind of inclusions in Petra Kucha at the Glasgow School of Art around creative responses to climate change. So I spoke about the built environment at that. And then from there, I did the Crisis Studio project. So that was, I got multidisciplinary tutor teams, and we used students' ongoing work as an armature to teach them sustainable design skills. So we stripped all of the formality and the kind of the traditional taboos in architecture school, the things that tell you you cannot be wrong. You must also always project being confident and right. And we had these crisis studios where students could just ask and say, I'm not totally sure how to do this. What would you recommend? What can we do? And we had these really kind of lively and vibrant spaces where students' work was up all over the walls. We had loads of different tutors that were architects, retrofit coordinators, engineers, builders, activists, and we just kind of cycled the room. And it was a really incredible thing to watch because it was the sort of thing I really would have loved that when I was in university. But it was really, it's gone kind of from there. So there's been, and lots of the kind of typical workshops now are in climate literacy, and that used to be in person, but since COVID shut everything down, I then kind of digitized that and redeveloped it as an online workshop that can be interactive, that can just be a lecture. And that's I've now lectured at 15 different universities around the UK, the Netherlands, and Canada. So it's taken off without really trying to. It's not set out to be this big educational thing. It's really just been this huge call for urgency and honesty in where we are. But it's still kind of going kind of perpetuating itself and being asked to speak different places and feed into.
So all of that have been possible because you created the AAS, which stands for Anthropocene Architecture School. Can you tell us a bit more about it, please?
All right, so the Anthropocene Architecture School, it really takes its name from the geological epoch we moved into when human beings became the most dominant impact upon the Earth's climate. So I chose to use a name that wasn't using the words eco, green, or climate to really just provoke a bit as well. So what it is, it's an agile architectural education platform that's specifically focused on encouraging climate emergency responses, and it creates opportunities and spaces for learning and response to the climate crisis, especially in built environment spaces. But I have been invited into quite a few other ones to really talk about climate literacies around kind of the built environment. And lots of what it's done has it's been quite varied. It's gone from, like I said, an open protest that was a discussion event at 2019's Architecture Fringe in Glasgow. So to launch a new school of architecture, I launched it in the oldest Victorian music hall in the world in Glasgow, just for a wee bit of theatrics, because architecture doesn't really have a stock response for the theatrical, which plays quite well into what I do. And I've done loads of workshops now for different groups and different universities around climate literacy in the built environment, and quite often around kind of applying architecture for activism as well.
That's amazing. That's brilliant. And so, why did you created it? Like, what is like your final vision? Where are you going with it?
Yeah, I really started it because when I graduated, I'd had to do so much learning outside of the School of Architecture to learn about sustainable design, and I just thought I really want to leave architectural education in a better state for those who are going to do it after me. So if I can create that sort of fire alarm, that nudge, that big push towards really putting this for further up the agenda, because the climate has not been on the agenda as high as it should have been for a very long time. The long term vision is to be able to make the resources again as open source as possible, as public as possible, to really develop that kind of climate literacy starter kit into a fully developed curriculum that again is open source that people can use as they need to. And it means that if a School of Architecture won't teach it, a group of students can pick it up and run with it themselves. It's of no burden to anyone. The labour's already been done. And yeah, just the whole. I don't really have an end game because I started this as a protest because I'm a climate activist at heart, and I really just wanted to set off that fire alarm in the sort of in the architecture school, and really just show as many people that would listen that we're in a state of climate and ecological emergency. To say the house is on fire is now an understatement. There's so much that needs to be done, but there's business as usual in architecture is just kind of is ticking on. And every so often, when we do have things that are starting to happen, we've got the Architects Climate Action Network, and that's fantastic. And that shows there's so many people that they want somewhere to put their energies. And Architects Declare have now started doing their kind of conferences online and their workshops and their principles and their guides and stuff. So there's so much energy, but the architecture schools and architecture as a whole still really feels to be kind of going on as if nothing was happening. So yeah, so I'm sort of stuck between a rock and a hard place because I've pulled the fire alarm, but no one's left the building yet. So it's kind of we're really trying to raise that awareness and that attention, because the climate is not just climate, but we've got all of these interweaving crises at the moment. We've got kind of COVID we've got a huge health crisis, but sustainability and public health are entirely inseparable, and we've got this opportunity over the next few years to have the most impact we can. So Naomi Klein says it really succinctly: we are alive at the moment where taking action could save lives on an unimaginable scale. And that is incredibly blunt, but it's true. If whatever we do now is going to have so much more of an impact than it would have in 10 years' time. So lots of what I do is just I bring that energy into the room. So if I'm invited to speak as part of a program or as part of an event, I always bring that sort of urgency and that honesty with whatever I do. Whether it's a climate literacy, is always very honest. It's very straight to the point. And if I'm asked to give a provocation, I will very, very happily give a provocation and just kind of hit that point home as hard as possible because yeah, I in 2018 we got told very bluntly that we need to see an unprecedented societal transformation, and a world in which we stay below 1.5 degrees does not look like the world that we are currently operating. We've even seen a report came out just a couple of days ago from the World Meteorological Organization, and it said even though COVID slowed the world down, carbon emissions have not been lowered. We're still going up. Carbon stays in the atmosphere for 200 years. So even though that's happened, we've got this huge urgency, and we're not seeing. You don't see that in the press. We don't really see it from politicians that often. And architects have this. We still have this social license. So this platform of being this nexus point between different people involved in creating buildings and operating cities, and we could be of so much positive impact if we are very honest with how things are and what's possible, because incredible things are possible. And in my architectural education, I was not taught about all these incredibly positive things that buildings can be. I wasn't taught about the living building challenge. I wasn't taught about pacifist. I wasn't taught about uh, kind of building biology, all these other different incredible things, regenerative design, or there's so many things that have been done that are possible. We've already got all these stories we can be telling, but architecture schools don't tell those stories. And that's, for me, that's, it feels like such a lost opportunity. We have all these future designers going through university, and if we don't tell them the stories of things going right and of things that are done well, then they're going to go into kind of working and just expect that everything has to be the way it always has always been. And if we give them that sort of the optimism and the space to cultivate their imagination and to try different things, to have a really big part of sustainability is, for years we've just talked about the three-legged stool. We've talked about environment, economics, and social sustainability. But there is a fourth one, and that's been very common to talk about in regenerative design for a very long time, but just not in architecture. So the fourth one is our worldview. So the worldview that we have impacts everything that we design. It informs us. What we design reinforces that worldview. So for the past kind of century or so, we've had this worldview that we must always have endless economic growth, and we must always keep on, like, fossil fuels can keep on going and we can pull carbon down. It's totally fine. But that's not, we really need to start challenging that. And architecture school is a fantastic space for challenging norms, for challenging worldviews. And I really feel that's something that's been lost. We're not, we're set a brief. We're not encouraged to interrogate how do you design housing that is not just in your modernist block? How do you design schools where the school building is the teaching resource? So we could be pushing architecture school into incredibly positive and really imaginative spaces. But for me, it just has felt for a very long time that's not happening. So if it takes someone to be a kind of a literal fire alarm and to raise that and to challenge, lots of what I do is provocation and challenge. So that's sort of what my voice has become architecturally.
Yeah, I completely get you because yeah, right now as I'm a third year student in architectural technology, so it's slightly different from architectural school, but we are facing the exact same issue as you mentioned, because that's why I started this podcast to get some knowledge and share it with my classmate and other people about like sustainability and how to achieve sustainability in architecture, because we don't have that much. I mean, I think we had like one class where it was like really put forward, but except that, no, it's just like we've been told to do architecture as usual, and that's it. So
Yeah, business as usual is simply not an option at this moment in time. Yeah, it's really interesting that you say that as well, because one thing I've noticed is that the thread that seems to be missing is that the context of where we are, that business as usual, the assumption that things will indefinitely continue on the exact same path, the same trajectory, there'll be no consequences of it. And that really feels to be it feels like denialism, to be very honest, in lots of spaces. But what I found is that when I talk to practices, it's not as if people are ignorant to what's going on. They don't know where to look, or your time is so taken up by one thing that you don't have endless hours to go and look elsewhere to break away from what you've been taught. So we've had lots of the people doing the teaching today were taught in a system that's exactly the same, that assumes all the same things, and to be telling someone that, okay, we've got to radically overhaul architecture. So what you've been doing isn't actually good. That to some people is going to come as a little bit of a shock. And if you've been given awards for your work as well, in particular, to then be told by someone potentially significantly younger than you, that it's probably a little bit of the difficulty as well. But I find that worldview is such a the book that I took that from is called Designing Regenerative Cultures. And it's an incredible book. I would recommend every single student, regardless of discipline, reads this book. It's one of those books that you have an epiphany every few pages, and it pulls together so many different threads about sustainability. So it pulls together everything from kind of systems thinking to panarchy to permaculture to biophilic design, but it pulls it all together in such a narrative that just clicks. And it's a book that I wish I'd been recommended to read whilst I was in university, because it just pulled together so much I've been learning about from other spaces. But to challenge that worldview, that business as usual, that kind of the assumption that everything is going to continue the exact same. We are not going to change how we design buildings. We're going to keep on knocking stuff down. Housing is always going to look the same. And there's this assumption. And I think if there's one big thing I would encourage students to do is to really challenge that worldview, and even to take the time to kind of reflect upon that yourself. When you're doing design, ask, why am I designing a certain way? Is this the best? Is this the way that I think is the most positive? Or have I actually just been told that, as someone told me in my education, this is how buildings are, this is what design is, this is good design? And always ask questions. So an incredible book that I would love people to read more. It's one of my absolute favorites. It's called From What Is to What If by Rob Hopkins, and he asks so many what if questions, but he also brings in all the examples of people doing things differently, all these incredible responses to climate change that are not they're not always high tech, they're not always very shiny. It's not a Tesla. It's so many different doable, replicable things that we could be doing. And it's exploring that instead of just taking the suggestion, going with what your worldview says, this is the best way to do it, questioning, like, what if this acted differently? So the Living Building Challenge asks, what if a building functioned like a flower, like a plant or a tree? What if it was net positive water usage? What if it was net positive in energy use? What if all the materials in this building were safe for all species for all time? And this is a really incredible, like, ambitious challenge. It's very hard to do. I think there's one building in the UK, the Curedon Valley Visitor Centre. Is an incredible building, but when you start to look at these buildings and how they work, they give back more to the environment around them than they take away, and the environment is better off for those buildings existing. And this is not new. These are not a recent development. These have been steadily being racked up for the last decade or so. So the fact that architecture schools are not showing students, look what's possible, look what's if we go beyond just sustaining. To sustain is to aim for zero. And I think it's a shame to be encouraging students to just aim for zero. It's a zero sum game. When you could be actually asking them, okay, so your challenge for this project is to go beyond sustainable. We want you to design buildings that are regenerative, that are positive for people's health, are positive for the environment. This is it's a question, so it's how you frame design. And I think that's something I would really encourage everyone listening to do more of. Ask more questions. And I think my favorites are always now going to be what if. I'm going to blame that book. That book has made what if questions far too easy to come up with, but it also helps you unblock your kind of design kind of thinking as well. So instead of just going around in circles for a while, you can ask, what if this was entirely different? What if this housing block was self-sufficient? What is necessary for this building to be self-sufficient? What if it was? And then push beyond that zero-sum game, because when you start to look at buildings like this, they're incredible. They're amazing spaces, and they're all really inspiring stories. But those stories are missing from architecture schools at the moment, sadly.
So why do you think that architectural schools and other schools that teaching people to go into the building environment are not putting like sustainability like as a main part of the course? I don't know how does it work in the UK. Is that the government deciding for that, or just the schools?
Well, in the UK, there is the kind of the ARB and the RIBA have the kind of parts around the educational curriculum. But to be very upfront with that, I do know there is good work happening at the moment. Things are starting to be changed. Schools are starting to change curriculums in places. There was a fantastic story from, right. I'm gonna have to make sure I get this right. Think it was right. I think it was the Queen's University of Belfast. I was told by there was a at one of the ACAN educators workshops. This lecturer said this head of school said, we are going to change our curriculum in a day. We're going to look at it and we're going to brainstorm. We're going to talk about it. We're going to see what needs to change. And then in that university, they then started to do bits with other parts of the school to bring in climate literacy. So that was an immediate response that's possible. But with the different schools, they do have to. One big block that I've noticed and has been flagged up by lots of other groups as well, the people doing the educating don't always have this knowledge as well. So a very big kind of hindrance is that we don't have the capacity, and that's not an insult to anyone. That's not to put people down. It's because we've been educated by a system that does not take climate change seriously. So if you're then educating, having received your education from a system that does not take climate change seriously, that's not on your radar, and that's not your fault. That's not an insult. That's not me trying to be offensive. That's just to say the education system, by and large, not just in architecture, it's just as bad in economics and other courses. We have not been responding to this ongoing emergency in the same magnitude that it is. So even recently, Time Magazine did an article that I was included in somehow, got interviewed for that, and that was looking at different responses internationally around bringing climate into education. So there are lots of stories of things starting to happen, but it's not normal yet. A fringe sort of it's still a fringe opinion, which is really hard to kind of come to terms with the fact that there is this huge existential emergency, and to talk about it in education is seen as fringe, which makes absolutely no sense. It blows my mind on a daily basis that it's seen as what I do is not seen as the norm. It's seen as this kind of slightly quite radical, quite forward pushing, but all that I'm doing with the teaching I do is taking climate change seriously and responding like the house actually is on fire, and not just kind of pretending that nothing's happening and that we can keep on doing the same thing. But I think for a lot of people that is hard. There's a really good experiment I always quote in my workshops. It was the 1960s. Some scientists decided to see how people respond to emergencies in groups and by themselves. So what they do is took a research subject, and they gave them a survey, and they put them in an empty room and they filled in that survey. But to make it interesting, they started to fill the room with smoke. So as you're filling in a survey, if you're by yourself and you see smoke come in the room, you panic, you get up and you run. Every single person by themselves got up and they ran away. But when you put people in groups, and twos, threes, anything, 2 out of 3 people actually had to be removed from that room full of smoke by the researchers, because people wait to see other people respond. So I always say, when you imagine that, but imagine that on a societal scale. So when we look at the newspaper, we don't see a headline every single day about climate change. Our politicians do not talk about climate change every single day. the people that get are looked up to, that are admired, that have platforms. We don't have people doing that every single day. Some people do, and they do an amazing job. There's been people pushing this for decades. There's been people doing incredible work around the world for decades. But when in the UK, if we look at our kind of general media, we are not seeing that panic, that alarm. So when you look at academia as well, we're still in the same society. We're not seeing this everywhere. So that's very difficult for some people to kind of respond like it's an emergency if they're not seeing someone do it first. So it's a kind of it's a little bit long-winded. I do appreciate it, but it's for a lot of people it does seem very insurmountable. I always get at least one person in a practice workshop who says, I don't know if there's any point. But the thing is, there's always a point in trying. Every single action we take, every fraction of a degree counts. Every fraction of a degree that we don't go above 1.5 degrees is people that is that's hurricanes that aren't as intense. That's sea level rise that isn't as high. That's not as high temperatures. That's an incredible impact. So we are again at this moment in time, we have this opportunity to save lives or to improve lives on an unimaginable scale. And I think that's to frame it like that. So we are not just saving lives by acting. We can improve lives at the same time. You have things like the Green New Deal kind of movements that you're seeing all over the world. So in America, in the EU, in the UK, people are pitching a kind of this whole systems change, just transition, that by decarbonising society, we can create incredible livelihoods and jobs and communities. And that's a story and a narrative that we don't see very often. You don't see on the newspaper kind of, don't worry, guys, if we all change what we're doing and we stop funding fossil fuels, we defund the military, we stop blowing things up for no reason, we really just we've got all in. We don't see newspapers doing this. We don't have that narrative. But people have been telling that story for decades. They've been saying, if we go all in on this, we could radically improve lives all around the world. We could have this real sense of climate justice, not just for the kind of like where we are. We are very privileged to not see the impacts, but many, many millions of people, they're not so lucky. There are people being moved people have to move. People are ill every single day because of climate change. But we don't see that. We don't that urgency just does not seem to be there. And I think if we start, if more than one of the most important things that you can do is just to have these conversations. And what I find that in the work that I do, when you create the space for those conversations, it's like you've kind of let a dam down for people, and people they've wanted to talk about this, but they've not had that space made for them before. And sometimes we do feel we need that kind of permission to share because we don't know if other people are feeling the same way. So that's why when I do work with students, I use a kind of, when it's online, I use a word cloud generator so they can see how hundreds of other students feel about climate change at the same time. So it means instead of just wondering, am I the only person that's feeling this way? What can I do? Where can I apply my energy? You can see that there's lots of other people because that's the thing. There are so many people doing incredible work, and that's a story we also really need to celebrate. I've been really really lucky to meet lots of people doing this in Scotland, where I'm from, and through the Architect Climate Action Network, and then internationally, people are really keen to tell their stories and to share what they're doing, and I think that's a real positive. And to be asking people onto your podcast to be able to share stories like that, there's so much positive impact that's going to have as well. And I think it's really great to have even a space like this. That's why I'm delighted to be asked to speak. I can talk for quite a while, and yeah, it's just I find that once you start to look at all these positive things being done, and it's the narrative. We don't have that kind of that's what's incredible about the Green New Deal as a whole. And when you start to look at the different groups, they're telling stories. They're not just saying use less plastic because plastic's bad. They're saying we want jobs that support people, that are not damaging the environment, that transition our entire way of living to one that's in balance with planetary boundaries. And that's stories from that could be incredible. If that was to be in the brief for every single architecture school project, they would be transformed in a year. if that was the kind of the ambition. And that's what we need. We need ambition, we need the imagination. Yes, we do need to look at the climate emergency head on and say, okay, this is pretty terrible. The magnitude is huge. We need to do something. We cannot continue with business as usual. Business as usual, it isn't an option. It's to continue with it is to disregard the damage that it does. And I think it's a really good thing to question it. So to be questioning that worldview, to question the not just the kind of the worldview, but even culturally as well. So why do we say this is the best way to build this building? What is the precedent? Are we have we explored what's been done before? Have we looked far enough back? Have we looked at what we built with before we just used concrete and everything? How you can do some incredible things in the built environment. And that's the positive side of my work. This is the part I really enjoy, the positive, the stories, the all the things that have been done, because incredible things have been done. It's just the case of finding them and sharing them. And that's an incredibly positive thing to be doing.
So yeah, let's talk about your work. You said you're doing workshop with the AAS. So what are you doing during your workshop to help people to take action?
Okay. So typical workshop begins and we really contextualize what the what the climate crisis actually looks like, what that means for people around the world, because in places like the UK we are very fortunate to not be facing climate impacts every single day. So it begins and it looks into the kind of just enough of the science to understand kind of what these reports coming out mean. So why we keep talking about parts per million or temperature rise, what that actually means in terms of impact. So all the workshops begin and I'll set the scene. So it's this is where we are today. There's always the climate justice is always incredibly prevalent. It has to be factored in. So, for example, 92% of all the greenhouse gas emissions that pushed us above 350 parts per million came from the global north. So, in the global north, we have this huge responsibility to go far faster than we're going. So, we need to set that scene. So, I take it very seriously in that regard. So, we set the scene, but we also bear in mind that people do have a very emotional response to climate change, and that can manifest in several different ways. So, everything is always done in a way that's careful to respond to that, to give people the space to talk about it if they want to. And so when I've done workshops with students, I did some with Trada, we had some word clouds so students could feed in their how they felt or their responses to questions, so they could see the responses of hundreds of other students at the same time. So it's like you set the scene, you really recognize the impact, and once you've done that, you start to put the built environment into that context of crisis, and you start to kind of quantify how much of an impact is the built environment having, how big a potential does it have to be a solution? Because for years we've been looking at it and we've been kind of slightly tweaking it, but if we were to really embrace what needs to be done and really push beyond just sustaining that what we're doing and go to regenerative practices, that could be it could be an incredible positive asset in our kind of climate action toolkit. And then once you've kind of talked about where the built environment sits, you then go into existing solutions and strategies and resources. So it ends. I always end on as positive a note as possible, because when you're talking about climate change, we really need to end on a note where people feel empowered to do things. So I spend the last kind of third of the workshop going through this is what's already been done. These are stories of things that have succeeded. These are resources we can just pick up and use tomorrow morning if you so want to. And so really it's setting the scene, putting the built environment into it, and then giving people the means and the tools to go and learn more and put things into action themselves. So that's your sort of typical structure to a workshop. I've just managed to get that down to an hour. It is incredibly fast. There's it's as energetic as I am. It's a little bit of a kind of a storm of things with a breather in the middle. But I think it's always really important to. It's one thing we don't really do in architecture schools at the moment, is talk about the context into which we are putting buildings on a real global scale. Then even locally, we still miss quite a lot. And I always stress the kind of four laws of ecology that Barry Commoner spoke about heavily as well. So bringing all of these different things into one manageable kind of bite-sized foundation that people can from there they can decide, okay, I want to learn about this. They can go and learn about more resources, or I want that building fits into the project that my practice is trying to do. And quite a few times out now, I've been invited into practices to talk to their staff as well. I taught the educating staff at Glasgow School of Art for architecture, and I've done different variants of these workshops to really tailor it to whatever people want to focus on. So I had some landscape architects who really wanted to know what the landscape contribution could be. So took that workshop, spent a couple of weeks doing some research for them, threw that together, and then there's no landscape variant as well. So that's the kind of typical. I've done other sorts of things as well, but that's the kind of climate literacy in a sort of hyper distilled way of doing it.
That's brilliant. And do you record your workshop? Like, if I can't do it, can I still have access to it, or different resources like lectures or other type of resources like blog posts or maybe whatever articles that you find interesting and that we can use to take action?
Yeah, so I've started kind of bringing together people that are going to do lectures. So I had the Better Block Foundation last year, and that was the kind of launching year number two. So instead of launching year two with a kind of me talking, I passed the buck to Krista in Dallas, and she talked through how the Better Block got started and how they apply their kind of tactical urbanism on a bigger non-profit scale. So it's kind of the workshops is what I kind of day to day. I do bits of that, but I've done stuff with the Lockdown Festival of Architecture. I do bits and pieces alongside ACAN's education group. So as the Students' Climate Action campaign has got started, I've been one of the speakers at a few of their events, and I've done lectures on different things about applying kind of, I'm not just applying climate literacy, but kind of taking action in your own education, practice, and personal spaces as well. So I've done a fair few lectures, and I've got other people in to talk about stuff as well.
Okay, perfect. And how do we access to it? Like, how do we have access to all your resources that you created it?
So in March 2019, I started to put together a climate breakdown library. So this is a reading list full of all these resources and videos and podcasts that I just use an Instagram account to do it because it's immediately accessible for people. They can just find it anthropocene.a.s.library, and you've got kind of almost 100 different resources, loads of free ones. There's loads of podcasts that you can. It's all kind of curated to point you in the direction of things. And then just in March 2021, I did a kind of a crash course climate literacy toolkit. So I did like a starter kit that it's all online, everything is free, there's no paywalls. It's a curation of all these resources that kind of link architecture to climate change, talk about responding like it's actually an emergency, what you can do, and how you can respond imaginatively to that as well. So I've been doing lots of open source materials. So instead of it only being dependent upon whenever I'm speaking, I do as much as possible that people can just pick up and run with. And I'm looking at ways to develop that even more into the future so it can kind of be a bit more formalized. At the moment, it's very, very agile. So it's not been very dependent upon kind of systems or infrastructure, but going into the future, that's something I'm going to do as well. So I've done a few kind of one pagers to really explain linking architecture, buildings, and climate just really concisely. So if you were to wanting to talk to, say, a member of parliament or someone about lobbying, you've got all of these key figures that you can reference back to and link, and to really explain to people the big impacts on one sheet of A4. So I've done lots of little bits and pieces like that, but the most of it is open source. So I'm really just trying to give people the means to do this sort of learning as urgently as they want to, on as big a scale as they want to. And that's the whole impetus is to catalyze action. It's not just for me to talk, it's for as many people as possible to be able to learn, to share, to have discussions around it, and really to just open up that space as much as possible.
That's the end of this episode. I hope you enjoyed it and that now you're ready to take action. Because we need to take action. This climate crisis is real. This is real things. And our institutions like government and university, they don't do that much. I mean, we are facing the same issue as 50 years ago. 50 years ago and nothing had changed. Why? Or very little. I mean, there is a lot of things happening there and there, but nothing real. no big change. We are still going downhill so fast. We need to change that. And that can only be changed if we take action. We need to stop to wait for our institution to do something and then we can follow. We need to lead the change like Scott is doing with his architecture school. I mean, this is brilliant. This is what we need. We need more of that. And we need to be part of it to create this change. So go have a look at his website. Go have a look at his library. It's brilliant. There is a lot of resources. There is so many things that I've never heard of before. And it's brilliant. It's just like easy to put in place, and I mean, it's just too easy. So before our next week's conversation, please think about it. Think about how you can change it. And you'll see you're gonna have a lot of ideas coming on, and you have the power to change it. And you just need to take action. That's it for today, and I'm looking forward to our next week's conversation with you. Bye, love you.